Looks like we're recording now. So last week I wasn't able to attend, and I learned not to make that mistake this time around because I discovered I was assigned some work. I started to picking up from where we had started with 2 weeks ago, not last meeting, but the prior meeting, with the doc that I had kind of put together with some of the different examples. Try to go to a more formalized, excuse me, and put something in a Git repo, makes it a little more formal. And yesterday, thank you to Jim for taking time to chat with me, and thank you to Cyril for taking the time to chat with me. I had spent more time reviewing the CRDs from the 4 operator projects with Cas Operator, InstaCluster, and Sky. I reached out to Stefan from InstaCluster, but I guess he's pretty sick, so hopefully he gets better soon. And then looking at some Kubernetes design proposals, get a feel for how things are written, and definitely not what I've come up with today. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And kind of like I did the 2 weeks ago with that doc, I found sections of commonality, and starting with the cluster topology. Let me see here. So there's a lot of overlap with the CRDs around how you define the Cassandra topology, and it's certainly very important. So I thought that would be a good start to try to formalize the different data types. So I have so I'll go through, start talking, and feel free to interrupt and at any point. The first type that you see listed here is rack, which shouldn't be very surprising. It's a common with all the CRDs, and the data types. I have fields for maps for the labels, annotations, and tolerations. The thinking is that the labels that are being should be one of the things that should be sufficient for generating the node affinity and pod anti-affinity rules. That seems to have more or less been the case with the operators thus far. And then I've seen where in different places where annotations are added to the different CRDs, and I added it, and similarly, well, we'll get to the tolerations in a moment, but added it at the rack level, in the event that thinking versus just simply being, say, at a data center or cluster level, maybe you're rolling out doing a canary rollout for a particular rack, and maybe you want to apply some annotations, or there's something for some reason that you want to have more fine-grained control over applying different annotations per stateful set. And I think up until a few weeks ago, I really wasn't terribly familiar with tolerations, but taints and tolerations. But I think that it makes sense to be able to complement the affinity and anti-affinity. The good example is I can use the node affinity to specify that the node affinity and pod anti-affinity to specify that my Cassandra pods should run on particular nodes, and that they should not be co-located. And I can use taints and tolerations to make sure to repel other non-Cassandra pods. Or another example would be if I have Cassandra pod and maybe other pods running that I do want with it on a particular node, on a particular Kubernetes node, and there are issues with the node or nodes, and I could apply a taint to that node to evict it and have it rescheduled elsewhere. One of the things that I mentioned here is, okay. I have a question here for the pod template spec. This is just, I was just updating this document not that long ago, and it's definitely a work in progress, and there should be needs to be a section or where I capture questions, open questions. Does it make sense? Does the pod template spec, should that be exposed? I know fairly recently, CAS operator made changes to expose it, and if so, does that need to be exposed? With what granularity? Does it need to be done at the rack level, the whole data center? And so I didn't get hung up on that because the focus is on, my focus right now is on topology, but it was a question that had popped up while I was going through this. The next type I have here.
I wanted to say, if I can interrupt, about the number of nodes per rack. You say you don't want it to be specified at the rack level, the number of nodes.
Correct. I had to refresh. Sorry, this is. Let me scroll down. So you see, so then the next type I have declared, what I have here is the data center, where that does you specify the number of nodes per rack.
Okay.
Sorry.
That makes sense. That's okay. At the cluster, at the data center level, that's fine.
Yeah. So I'll start here at the data center. So specifying the cluster name, the data center name, and the nodes per rack. I talked with, like I said, we were talking yesterday with Jim and Cyril, and I think I think there's probably, for everyone in the call, probably general consensus that wanting to have balanced racks in terms of having equal number of nodes. If that's not the case, if you think otherwise, then go ahead and speak up, and we have discussion about that. There's different property names in the different CRDs for specifying whether you want, like CAS operator, for example, said, for the affinity, CAS operator says hard or soft, which kind of maps to, the language used in the Kubernetes docs. I forget off the top of my head what the term is in the instance cluster operator and CAS operator. But I also was looking at one of the more polished Postgres operators. There's several Postgres operators as well, and I think they just use pod anti-affinity. So I decided, well, to make it pretty explicit there with the accepted values being what they map to. To try to make it self-documenting. And again, so having at the data center level, also declaring labels, annotations, and tolerations, and merging them. What the fields that I have listed here, again, just to reiterate, is right now just the focus is around the topology. So there's obviously a lot more with that to be covered, but that's just the initial focus. So one of the burning questions that I've had, and that was eager to talk with Jim and Cyril, was in the CASCOP CRD, you define for the topology the cluster, and then you declare the data centers within it and the racks. In the CAS operator, by contrast, your top level type is the data center, and you would simply create a second. If you want to have a multi-DC cluster, you simply create a second data center object and make sure they have the same cluster name, and then the operator will, takes care of the rest. So I was trying to figure out or come up with a proposal that, and both in those conversations, there are both interesting and very good explanations and motivations for the particular changes. And so I was trying to figure out what would be a good proposal for that going forward. And so what I came up with last night is having a cluster type, and it consists, again, keeping with the theme of being able to define your labels, annotations, tolerations at each level, and then having them propagate down and be merged. But more importantly, you'll see here, I've declared a type, a data center ref, which is just a object reference. And then I have an array of data center objects and an array of data center refs. So to make it a little bit more clear with an example of some YAML would be, so I create a cluster objects, and I have an array of data center objects where a data center is fully defined in line, which would look pretty similar to what you see with, if you look at an example, a manifest for CASCOP, and then also see also making use of the data center refs, where it's just, I've only specified the name, but I could specify the minimally, you'd have to minimally specify the name. The resource ID could be specified as well, but minimally the name.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So what's the use of, what's the intent of having a different object for the data center? I can see how useful it could be by doing so. Why? It seems that having everything in one place, one object where you see exactly the topology there makes sense. But it seems that you're trying to make both.
I don't know if I froze or you froze.
That's what I understand from the data center refs. I think that's what you're doing, right? So yeah. So my question, I hope the internet is good. So my question is, what's the use case? What's the goal? What's the main purpose of having a distinct object for data centers?
So well, there are multiple things. One is in thinking about going through the work of adding and removing data centers from a cluster, and I thought, given the complexity of all the roles and responsibilities, seeing that there's potentially could be a clear delineation of work. So you could have a separate controller for a cluster at the cluster level. And I've further down described that. So having a data center controller, a cluster controller, whereas the data center controller is just watching for data center resources. The cluster controller will watch for both. And the cluster controller would handle the orchestration of adding and removing data centers to the cluster. So it's not doing anything that's not already done in terms of, you know, the support for multi-DC deployments. It's simply well, like I said, a more delineation of responsibilities.
Let me ask, Cyril, is it because we're essentially putting something in a YAML file that Kubernetes won't really support with a multi-data center like this?
No, I mean, you can have one object or multiple objects in, in even the same YAML file. There won't be any issue. I'm just wondering how useful it is to have those objects as different objects. I mean, I'm not sure, for example, that having two controllers brings anything on the table. I mean, the controller of the cluster wouldn't do anything. I mean, I feel like it would just tell the data centers to use that cluster name, or maybe that configuration file, or maybe things like that. So in a sense, just a way to inherit for the data center some properties. That's what I understand from what I read. I'm trying to, you know, get a sense of what's the purpose of having different objects and split the cluster in different objects. Would it be easier to just duplicate the data center for another cluster? I'm trying to understand, you know, how useful it would be. For now, we create a cluster, we have the configuration of the data centers in the cluster, everything is in there. You want to know what's the topology, you just go into the cluster and you see everything. You don't have to, oh, there is a data center called A. Okay, let's see that data center called A. Oh, this is a configuration of the data. We don't have to, you know, walk through those different objects. Everything is in one place. We see one thing. So that's why I'm asking, how is it helpful to have different objects? I'm not sure I understand your arguments, John.
So sure. So one of the motivations. So I'll come back to what I was describing before, but then I'll mention one of the other motivations was to try to arrive at a middle ground for what I think. So what I was hoping in talking with you yesterday, Cyril, with Jim, was helping to reach more convergence, which I did with I had questions for each of you guys, and it was really helpful because there was convergence on some of the things. Seeing, like, I had some questions about different fields I wasn't sure about, doing the upgrade strategies and canary upgrades, and seeing there's a lot of similarity there. But in terms of the topology stuff, so it was my way of trying to see trying to come up with a way that is incorporates the ideas that both of you expressed yesterday, without me taking trying to maintain the middle ground. With it also, so that's what the one point. But the other one, I do see value in, you know, you said I see potential value with having the separate controller, because like I said, with the division of labor, being able to potentially makes it more testable, easily testable. And then when you get into, now, I don't know, you know, you have more experience than I do, so you probably, you know, I'll take put a lot more weight with, you know, your thoughts on it. You know, but I mentioned here in terms of getting into updating the replication settings, and then dealing with clients to for adding or removing DCs, any notifications or image updates, for example, with clients that would have to happen. In terms of the why the motivation for putting in, say, doing it inline, and then also with the reference, was the thought. I can see where the object, if I've got, let's say I've got, could get to be quite large. So give you as a way to keep it more concise. So that was the thinking there.
I like your arguments of the testing arguments. I think it's a good one. So we don't have to create a whole cluster just to test just a data center object, for example. So that's something interesting. And I understand that you want to, make two different words work altogether using the same way of configuring. So yeah, it makes sense to me. Sorry, Eldon, I think you wanted to.
Oh yeah, sorry. I did want to interject, not to come out of left field here, but one of the useful elements of separating different subparts into standalone Kubernetes objects is you can use some of the built-in status capabilities when you're operating on those Kubernetes objects as well, right? So you could imagine a data center having a distinct sort of status from the rest of the cluster at a given time. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. That was my other point.
Okay, sorry, I must have missed it.
I also think some things we're trying to land in Cass Operator is like getting some more of the Cassandra entities managed declaratively. Like we already merged in getting users and their passwords and their super user status declaratively managed in Kubernetes. And so something like that, if we want to gel this all together, seems like it's more at the logical Cassandra layer, which is like a cluster-wide thing, right? And then we want to do key spaces and so on. So I think having different places to park that configuration that's most logical is really helpful.
Are you saying you want to have different entities for those types that you talked about? Like,
well, I'm not saying different not different kinds in Kubernetes, but just on the cluster, maybe I have a slice that's like users, right? Okay. And that makes more sense on that one than it does on the data centers. But we don't have this split right now in Cassandra.
Okay.
One thing that would make me nervous is if it's forcing topology on people. But I get the impression that it's not. This is somewhat optional.
Forcing Cassandra topology?
Yeah, like for instance, well, I don't think anyone should use simple snitch. But yeah, like this assumes you're using a snitch that does data center awareness, rack awareness. Let's say that someone's going to set up a small cluster. Would they have to go through all this setup in the YAML file to make it work?
I think from our experience, it's better to not set silly defaults that just are there for the sake of letting people put in 5 lines of YAML and get something, because it's more likely that someone will now put in 20 lines of YAML but forget the one thing that you defaulted, and now they get like they're like half rooted in something that makes sense and half rooted in like a kind of a bad configuration. And so I don't know, as long as it's not overly verbose, like I'm assuming you can, like on the stuff on screen, you could leave out all of labels. You just need the names. And yeah, so this would be like significantly shrunk down, or is that not right, John?
That's correct. You'll see on pretty much every one of the fields, except for the names, that they're optional. You have the emit empty. So that is correct. Yeah, I mean, yeah. That was just for illustration here because if I wanted to include the labels, since the focus is on topology, just to make it clear, how it would for the mapping to the zones. But
I don't think silencing the Cassandra concepts makes sense in the name of like, I think that's over indexing on making it too easy to adopt. It's like, sorry, we can't hide the idea of data centers and racks completely. Like, you're just going to have some amount of mentioning them. But if you don't want racks, just define one rack and move on.
Yeah, well, I think this is also parallel in the project where there's plenty of people saying we should stop defaulting to simple snitch and, you know, make NTS, or yeah, NTS is the default, just because it gets people into so much trouble from the beginning. So you start out not knowing that you just really screwed yourself over.
Yeah, I think we don't have to copy those defaults, in my opinion. It's like, why would you do all this work towards topology and then set up some pretty bleh defaults for them?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it was Jim made a really good point when us were talking yesterday, that you as a distributed database, clustered database with high availability, you download it, and everything is set up with the examples and defaults for running a single node by itself when you download it, install it. And so if you're completely new to Cassandra, it would be nice, and I know, Cassandra's been around, some of the tooling there's been around a lot longer than some of the tooling to make things easier. But, for example, like, well, here's, using CCM if you're running things locally, or Docker Compose, just some examples, even examples with the, maybe that's just some good additions in the community docs. But yeah, I would rather have sensible defaults that are going to be for more practical in like Kubernetes environment.
No more questions from me.
One question. Sorry. So you have data centers objects. So you have external and inner objects inside the cluster. So would those the inner data centers object, they would be managed by the data center controller or by the cluster controller? Would it mean that when the cluster sees those and that there is no existing object for them, it will create objects for them, and then the controller will just kick in and take care of them? So that's how you see it?
Yeah. So when I think if I understood your question correctly, I think I put my thoughts down towards the bottom here. Oh, so okay. In the scenario where, so you create, starting from scratch, I have my data center YAML. I create it. So the data center controller gets the notification, starts doing the reconciliation. The cluster controller also gets notification, and it will see that there's no cluster object yet created, and create the cluster objects and add the data center to the cluster object. And then at that point, then its work is done for the time being.
And at the end of the creation of that cluster, would the content stay like that, or would those refs be replaced by the actual data centers?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought of that. So if you create, so I don't know, I hadn't considered that. So if you create the data center object on its own, and then the controller, would it do it as a add it to the create the cluster object where it's fully inline, or if I don't know. And
we can keep that question for later.
Yeah.
Just trying to think of
Yeah.
how
and
all this would work together.
you know, and it there's, well, I'm sure with anything, once you get past, I mean, a design doc becomes, as soon as you start writing code, it becomes stale. So I'm so sure it'd be.
Yeah. So I asked that question for, you know, because when the cluster is set up, then how do you update the objects? Does it mean that you have to go on the cluster to update the objects that were directly added to the configuration, or do you have to go to each object? And as in that case, you are mixing references and actual object. I'm wondering, okay, you got the cluster, everything is set up. I want to add one more node to data center DC1. Should I look for the object, or should I go on the cluster itself? And what if I want to do the same on DC3? Can I do the same because the object will be just, the configuration will be just added to the cluster itself? Or in that case, there's only one choice, which is going on the object directly. That's why I'm asking, because you're mixing references and actual object directly.
That too is
no need for an answer if you, I mean, you
No,
don't need to have one. Just you know.
Yeah,
thinking.
That's a really good question, because I think that raises some points. One, in terms of making potentially making the implementation more complex, and two, I think it also potentially decreases usability as an end user. You know, you're trying to sort out, okay, what fields can I edit where, you know, when I'm looking at this, especially as it gets more, you know, gets more involved, you start throwing in other things. So I mean, I know there are times where I'll go make a change to something and forget, oh, I can't, you know, I'll have to go look to the source code to see and what things are read only. So yeah. So I think it's a good.
Same thing is today, if we want to just scale down or remove a data center, we go on the cluster object and we just delete it from there. And it does a scale down and delete the data center. What would happen in that case? Because in one case, I can just delete the content, but in another case, this is just a reference. Will it kick off the deletion of the data center, or just remove the reference in the cluster? What would happen? And, you know, and I guess the same action should have the same consequence on each one. So,
right.
Well, maybe this is a question that a particular Kubernetes administrator may want the all-in line way, and another one may want like the referential way, which I think would help if you're using multiple namespaces, or maybe like even the idea of multiple Kubernetes clusters, right? So maybe you shouldn't be mixing and matching them in one cluster, but I don't know, that's like validation that's easy to enforce. Enforcing that things are immutable is still a serious chore. Although we did it, I wouldn't really, I don't know. I guess I would advise like it can be done, but it's not as easy as it should be.
Yeah, so that's a good. So maybe enforcing one or the other, making it the use of the two mutually exclusive, and then the other thing you mentioned, Jim, is interesting. It's about multi-cluster. Just something I started trying to think more about for some other work past couple of days. I hadn't thought about it in this context, but that's interesting. And I hadn't looked a whole lot. I had went and reread Sebastian's post on multicast cop, but I hadn't spent much time looking to see what you guys have done with their. So that's I need to spend more time. So certainly, so in terms of the, I certainly the question serial to I make a lot of sense, particularly what are the implications of using a reference. Like I said, if you remove that, simply just removing the reference from the cluster, what is that? What is the behavior of that? What does that mean? That's certainly less clear than if you have it defined in line. And if it's a reference, then if you're using references, then maybe it's just a matter of, like I said, you have to go and delete the data center object itself.
If you're gonna have references, would there ever be a case where you have multiple clusters using the same data center or that reference the same objects? And if you intend to prevent that, how would you validate that?
That's another really good question.
These SIGs are working out great. Making John think, right, Omer? Right, John? Good job.
That's
Now he's thinking I shouldn't have missed the previous meeting.
yeah. Let somebody else who's not here. No, I mean the first thing that comes to the top of my head it would be, and I really don't like the idea of it, is that the controller is basically keeping a in-memory cache of the cluster objects in the data center reference names, so that way it can do validation. And I don't, and maybe that's not a big deal. I mean, in terms of the memory footprint, maybe that's small, but
let me pose a question in a different way. I would argue that the primary benefit of using references is so that you can decouple topology from the underlying database nodes, right? And the only reason you would want to do that or need to do that is if you were, if you're going to avoid just one-to-one mapping between those data centers and those databases. So if that's not a need, maybe this is introducing an unneeded complication or
yeah. So you said to decoupling the topology. How would that decouple?
So if we're talking about using data center references, right, in a cluster.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we could independently create data centers and then reference them in our cluster objects. But then again, we get into the scenario where we have multiple clusters using the same references to the same underlying data center objects. And like that'd be the only point in not declaring them in line is to, decouple those two things.
No, I don't think that's the case. I think not declaring them, if you declare it in line, like this whole object needs to live in one Kubernetes namespace, right? And if you're saying this is a multi-data center cluster, what does it mean that it's in one namespace? Like, do all the data centers exist in that namespace too? Like, I think that you're not making them referential so you can share them across clusters, which we don't think is that logical. I'm assuming never good to assume, but you know, that's not very logical. Like, you don't share data centers across different Cassandra clusters, but decoupling them from being all packed together means that maybe I'm going to run one data center under one namespace with some sort of the quota restrictions and whatever you get with that namespace, and a different one in a different namespace. And if I've got the network topology set up right, like maybe these are not even in the same region. I know multi-region Kubernetes is not really a thing, but I think it's just not a thing in 2020, and it will be a thing. The right solutions. So I don't know. For me, I think not listing. If you want to do like really good
so
distributed support, like tying these all into one masterpiece of YAML is kind of gonna be a serious hurdle at some point. You're gonna want to walk back and say, oh, now I need to like support multi Kubernetes cluster, multi whatever.
But that's what we did with multi-Cascop. So we have another object on top of it that just references those different clusters.
Yeah, same concept. Yep.
I think I forgot. One of the last things I did. One of the last updates that I made to the doc was making sure I added the cluster name or the cluster field to the data center object. And even if you had to put enough in there to uniquely, the cluster name by itself may not be sufficient, but enough to uniquely identify the cluster, I think then would make it easier to do the validation to make sure you don't wind up trying to make it easier to prevent assigning the same data center to multiple clusters. So I think I could be having that explicitly listed here, make that, I think, more possible.
Wait, I think that might have actually confused me further. Is that a circular reference then? So if you have a data center referencing a cluster, and then in your cluster you have references to other data centers.
It's yes and no. I mean, it's simply just saying the name of the cluster. As far as the data center controller, is that what I've described in my doc here? The data center controller, would see that name or anything else that would identify the cluster, and simply just wouldn't do anything with it. It's just okay. It's other than just validate that it's not empty, for example. But then it would be the cluster controller that's going to go ahead and when it sees the data center object created, would inspect that cluster name.
I see.
And Jim, you mentioned about the other thing was with potentially across you'd have different namespaces, which is interesting. That was something else that we could the reference to give you that option. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have enough experience in practice to know, is there a lot of application there, but it certainly is interesting.
Yeah. I think it's pretty challenging to design these things because you don't want to like leave aside like the important Kubernetes concepts, right? So like if you say like, oh, you have to create everything all in one namespace, like, which I've seen a couple operators do that maybe weren't even Cassandra operators, but it's like, oh yeah, we really only intend, you can only install the operator in a namespace named this, and it only looks in that namespace to do stuff. It's just like, feels very limiting. And I'm not sure if it's sort of just like those developers didn't work through the challenges. But I don't know. I in my mind, it was like a puzzle that needed to be solved. It's like, how do you let people use the namespaces as they see fit?
Is it because you think about using network policies to prevent some apps to access one data center?
Totally.
Using
Perfect example. Okay. Yeah, if you cut people out of namespace flexibility, like you've limited their options on something important like that. Great example, Cyril.
I have a hard stop for another meeting at the top of the hour. There've been, so before we run out of time, I'm willing to go back through. There's been a lot of really good questions and comments made, and make sure to get those down on paper. And I'd love it to continue discussing those prior to the next meeting, if possible. And I think I don't know if everyone's on the Slack, Kubernetes Slack channel on the ASS Slack. So I'll make a point to get questions and comments and try to continue some of the discussion going there.
I think going through this way is really good. I mean, there's no high level hand waving. It's like, how will this possibly work, in a good way for Cassandra noobs, Kubernetes noobs, like people who are moderately dangerous with both. So I don't know. I really appreciate you doing this, John.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to, and I also will not miss another meeting.
Well, on that note, what about meeting at the same time next week? So just the same hour next week. I can put it up on the calendar, but just so that we have a weekly cadence. And should I just schedule a weekly cadence from now until whenever? Those are kind of some open questions I have. Or keep the 2-week schedule and do the work in between on the mailing list and on Slack, and there's that. So I'll just open that up as what does everyone think?
I'm open to the weekly cadence. I know for me personally, the time zone work is, I mean, the meeting time in my time zone is fine. So, but I know for like the folks in France, it's late, but I'm on board for a weekly.
Yeah, personally, I'm okay with a weekly thing. If it's too late, then I'm not going to come, but I haven't said much, so I wouldn't be missed too much. So.
Yeah, this is a French humor.
Does this work for you, Cyril?
Yeah, it does.
All right.
Just 4 p.m. for me, so I'm good.
Okay. I will put another schedule up, or another meeting scheduled at this time for next week, and then work on getting a weekly schedule. It'll probably just be the same time 2 weeks in a row, just so we can keep that rotation going. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Jim nailed it on the head. Just kind of more high bandwidth conversation is what's needed. And we can give John really good feedback, and then he can go off in his workshop and tinker and update GitHub. Everyone has GitHub, the link, right? So you can set a watch on it as well. So anytime that there's a commit, you get a notification. That might be a good way to get information in as well.
Okay. Can we discuss additional fields that we have in the different CRDs for the cluster, for example? That's something we can discuss on Slack, by example. We don't have to spend our video time on details, but
yeah, there has been very little conversation on Slack, so yeah, please feel free.
We're shy, so now that we've got to start, and really thanks a lot, John, for doing that. We really appreciate that you did that. So.
Yeah, it's a good learning experience. Okay. What I'll do, like I said, I'll go back through the video prior to the next meeting, and I'll start adding the open questions to the doc. That might be the best thing, because it's very specific to what's in here.
Okay.
All right. Well, it's probably a good stopping place. We could we want to kind of close things off. Unfortunately, I mean, unless everyone wants to go another 2 hours. Yeah, no. Okay.
It's getting late here.
Yeah, Frank is like, I'm done.
Yeah, it's 11 p.m. now.
Yeah.
It's the best time now. No kids around.
Yeah.
Oh.
They're waiting for the last fish. So.
Yeah.
I goes. Anyway.
Great. All right. Well, let's see. I should stop this thing.